What if your hands weren't the one writing your story? Meet the spirit who progs a barrier between life and death. In the history of literature, there was an ancient belief among poets that their poems were, in reality, inspired by spirits or jinns, who whispered them into their ears. Among other nations, a similar belief existed, thought it was often attributed to the spirits and ghosts of past writers and poets. Many stories and tales have become famous in this field, and perhaps one of the most renowned is the story of Mrs. Pearl Curran, an ordinary woman who one night decided to play with the Ouija board with her friend. Because of this, her life was suddenly turned upside down, transforming into one of the most bizarre cases that has sparked debate for decades. The only ghost whose works were published and whose poems were printed in newspapers. Pearl Curran was a married woman living a quiet life with her husband, John Curran, in the American state of Minnesota. Her education was average, and she possessed neither a wild imagination nor vast ambitions. The only thing she truly loved in her life was music, which led to her childhood dream of becoming a famous singer. She took piano lessons, but like most people, she never managed to achieve her dreams. Mrs. Curran and her husband had no interest in literature or fame, and they owned nothing in their home but a few general books. They were not rich, but their life was comfortable. They had a maid, and they mostly enjoyed eating at restaurants and visiting theaters and opera houses. They were a social couple who loved meeting friends and playing cards with neighbors. During the day, when her husband was at work, Mrs. Curran spent most of her time with her friend and neighbor, Mrs. Emily Higgins. In 1912, Curran and Higgins were chatting at neighbor's house. This neighbor believed in the powers of the Ouija board, a wooden board that spiritual mediums claim can be used to contact the spirits of the dead. Mrs. Higgins jokingly suggested they contact the spirit of one of her relatives, although she only received some incomprehensible words through the random movement of her hands over the board's letters. She liked the experience so much that she decided to buy a Ouija board for herself. A few days later, she took it to the house of her friend, Mrs. Curran, to try it out. Mrs. Curran didn't believe in the powers of the Ouija board and considered it a silly tool to kill time, but she participated out of politeness. At first, the two women got nothing but meaningless words, but suddenly the subject began, as if there were a strange force. The board's pointer began moving between the letters rapidly to deliver this message. Many moons ago I lived, and now I have returned. Patience Worth is my name. Fear grabbed the two women. They were now certain they had received communication from a woman's ghost. When they asked who she was, the answer came through the board. She had lived across the seas between 1649 and 1694. In the days that followed, the two women continued to communicate with the ghost via the Ouija board. They later learned that she had lived in England, thought she didn't specify which part. However, the description she gave of the place where she grew up and was raised led many experts to believe that she was likely born in the English county of Dorset. They were also able to find out how she died, because Patience Worth told them she had traveled to America and landed on a shore near New York in 1694. It was under the control of the Danes at the time, called New Amsterdam, and it was nothing more than a fort surrounded by a group of wooden huts. She was killed by Native Americans. Although Mrs. Higgins attended most of the contact sessions with the ghost, the spiritual messages came to Mrs. Curran in a very special way. The messages began to accumulate until they seemed to be transmitted directly to Mrs. Curran's mind, making it more like telepathy. Mrs. Curran no longer needed the Ouija board to communicate with the ghost. Gradually, Patience Worth's words took the form of novels, poems, and thoughts about a previous life she had lived. For this reason, Mrs. Curran bought a typewriter to keep up with the ghost's open appetite for speech. The story of Mrs. Curran and the ghost Patience Worth gradually became known among people, and many visited her at home to see how she communicated with the ghost. To their astonishment, they would see her sitting behind the typewriter in an open, well-lit room, unlike spiritual mediums who often sat in a dark room surrounded by heavy curtains. Mrs. Curran described how she communicated with Patience's ghost, saying, "The words flew to me suddenly. I remember for moments with some pressure and weight on my head, and then scenes and images began to emerge clearly before me, as if I am watching a cinema film. I can see the precise details of every scene. There were two people talking, and then they would walk away. I could see the roads they were walking on, the scattered grass on the side of the road, and the distant background. They were speaking a foreign language. I could hear their words, which would come with a patient's voice to explain what they were saying, and what part of the speech I should include in the story. I would sometimes see myself in a museum, to the point that I recognized many tools and clothes that I had never seen in my life before, and which had been extant for hundreds of years. I heard words and sentences that no one had used for many generations. It seemed that Patience Worth was an educated writer of the first order. and her poems sparked the interest of critics. Newspapers began writing about her and printing excerpts for her poems. In 1918, she was chosen as one of the best writers in New York, and Mrs. Curran was invited to attend the American Poetry Festival that same year, sitting on an equal footing with the most famous poets and mechanics of the time. One of her novels was printed, titled The Storytale. Did you know that this novel is currently available in the markets and is also sold on Amazon under the title The Storytale Time of Christmas? And the author's name is Patience Worth. Some critics considered it a literary masterpiece. One of the famous American poets, in a response to skeptics of Mrs. Curran's story was a ghost, said, "I am not prepared to express my opinion in whether Mrs. Curran's poems originated from Patience Worth or not, but undoubtedly what she produced is a high-level literary work." In 1922, Mrs. Curran's husband died while she was 6 months pregnant. Afterward, her mother died that same year, and her financial situation worsened to the point that she accepted financial assistance from some friends. Over the following years, Curran married twice, but both marriages were failures. And in 1930, she moved to California to live with some friends. Despite all the circumstances and hardships she went through, her connection with a ghost Patience Worth never broke. It continued until November 25, 1937. On that day, the last contact between them occurred, and the last message was the strangest in the story. It was like a farewell message. When Mrs. Curran asked the ghost in surprise about the reason for this sudden departure, Patience told her that Curran would die soon. That night, Mrs. Curran told one of her friends, Dusty Smith, about Patience's last message, saying, "Oh, Dusty, Patience had just shown me the end of the road." Although Mrs. Curran wasn't complaining of any illness or health symptoms, she was suddenly afflicted with pneumonia and died on December 3, 1937, at the age of 54. For many years, the story of Beryl Curran was a subject of debate and discussion between supporters and skeptics, each side having its own arguments and justifications. Skeptics believed that it was a talent for writing and authorship that was latent within Mrs. Curran, and she needed a medium to bring it out. So she invented the character of the ghost Patience Worth to attract attention to her writings. This is because the strangeness of her story was what primarily contributed to her fame. One critic compared the subject to a long line of women, where one woman lifts her clothes to reveal her legs. Naturally, all eyes will turn towards her. Among the other arguments of the skeptics is that the existence of a woman named Patience Worth, who ever lived in Dorset, England, was never proven, nor was there ever a woman who died in America in 1694 by that name. It is this that some passages and references in Patience Worth's works seemed as if they were describing events in the Victorian era, an era subsequent to her death. As for the team of supporters of Mrs. Curran's story, they argue that it was never proven that Pearl Curran ever wrote poetry or author stories before her connection with the ghost Patience Worth, since she was of modest culture level and education. How then she was able to utter all the novels and poems in high literary language, containing old words and sentences dating back to the Shakespearean era, language that no one uses anymore. Moreover, one of the critics wrote a comment on this language and said, "The language is divided into 19% Anglo-Saxon and 10% French, with old words that haven't been used since the 17th century. So how can a woman living in the American states of Missouri in the 20th century, who has never visited England in her life, write in this language? Furthermore, how could she correctly describe areas and landscapes of a country she had never seen in her life? Also, the failure to find the name Worth in the 17th century records doesn't mean that she didn't exist in that era. It's not fair to compare population records of the modern era with the primitive and incomplete records of that time." One writer authored a massive book in the 20s of the last century, including dozens of testimonies about Mrs. Curran's case, and published an article in the newspaper at the time demanding anyone who had any information that could reveal Mrs. Curran's lies or even tarnish her reputation and dig into her past to contact him. But no one called. In conclusion, I want to tell you that the ghost of Patience Worth didn't end completely with the death of Mrs. Curran. For many years after her death, many claimants appeared who alleged that the ghost had contacted them, to the extent that one of them issued a poetry collection composed by Patience Worth. However, critics all agreed that the poems of that collection didn't in any way rise to the quality of the poems written by Mrs. Pearl Curran. Of course, as usual, at the end of the episode, I will be waiting for your opinion on the story of Mrs. Pearl Curran and the literary ghost Patience Worth. Are you with the supporters of the story or the opponents?